What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be talking all about the decentralized account structures. And if you run meta advertising, this is kind of my method to my madness of building, scaling, and growing ad accounts on Meta. And so really what this is for is how do you build your accounts in a systematic way that allows you to test audiences, test creative, and test your different scaling campaign structures in a very methodical way. One of the things I see in a lot of accounts that I review, I get to review accounts all the time, and one of the things I see when people are struggling is that their accounts lack clarity. Meaning, when you jump into the account, it's very hard to know what's going on, or they're doing too many things at one time within a campaign, and they're not really pulling any valuable learnings from it. Meaning, if it won, they don't know why it won. If it lost, they don't know why it's losing. And so in this video, what you're getting is a training that was recorded and people actually paid $100 in the past to get access to it. Now yours for free of this method. And it's a high-level approach of how do I build campaigns in ad accounts, anywhere from accounts spending, $1,000 a month to accounts spending over $3 million a month. This method is what I use for it. And so this will allow you to, how do you test audiences correctly? How do you test creatives? And so when you're watching this, what I want you to think about is essentially the principle of what I'm presenting to you, right? What is the overarching strategy of how I'm doing these things? And ultimately, what I want you to pull from this video is when you're creating campaigns, to be very intentional about everything you're doing in the account. When your campaigns are created a certain way, why are they created that way? What are you actually testing? And are you allowing way too many variables into that campaign to where if it wins or it loses, you don't really have an isolated reason as to why it won or why it lost, right? So what you will notice is that this video is about a year ago or maybe 2 years ago when we recorded it, and so many of the principles apply today. Now, some of the buttons might be in different spots, but ultimately what you're getting here for free is training that other people paid money for and has proven time and time again, it's still very similar to what we use today, how to build meta accounts using what we call the decentralized account structure. So with that said, make sure you have your pen and paper, take notes, watch it again, but enjoy this training on the decentralized account structure. Let's dive in.
Decentralizing your ad account structure for maximum scale and control. Okay. And so this is kind of a unique process that we've developed over the years to really, rather than hacking the algorithm, actually the purpose was, how do we start operating our ad accounts like a scientist? How can we create as much control inside of our accounts so that when you go to do tests, as every good marketer or advertiser should, how can you make sure you're producing the cleanest tests, right? And so when you use the system the way it's designed, it all flows together really nicely. So that's the big purpose of it. How clean can you start to build your accounts? When you do that, you start to get better data. And when you start to get better data, you make better decisions. And ultimately, that's how you scale. Roger. And when you start to do stuff like this, you start to get awesome results like this. This is one of our clients that started implementing these structured strategies, and instantly you start to see better results start coming out the gate. See stuff like this, or maybe you start to see this, where this was actually a local brick and mortar where you're starting to get 10 to 20x his marketing performance than he's ever seen before. This works for all kinds of companies, not just lead gen, not just e-com, but this is also local. You see things like this. You see things like this, especially when competing against other agencies. Maybe if you're an agency yourself and you're competing with other agencies, hey, we are the agency killer when we go against them. You can start implementing strategies like this to get better results. In fact, looks like some of these leads have gone over it. So you can see stuff like this. But it's really, the point is, when you do this stuff, it works, right? It works. And that's the basic point of this. Cool. All right, cool. Let's move on to the next slide. Most media buyers run their accounts off the old 2016 to 2018 model of media buying. Cool. Well, today we're going to show you the new way of media buying, right? The old is gone. It's dead. I want you to think about that right now, especially if you're OG. I want you to just try to remove anything you think about media buying from the past, remove it from your brain. right? The tactics and the insights, your ability to read data, that is going to serve you. That is going to be helpful. But I want you to start thinking about, I'm not trying to get the ad account to perform like it used to. I'm trying to find the new way that it performs and the new way I can run it. And that's how you want to start capitalizing.
You can think about it like this. When we train marksmen in the military, we actually prefer guys that have never touched a weapon in their whole life, because we don't have to untrain them from a bunch of bad habits that they learned plunking at rabbits in their backyard. We can just install the software and they go forth and do exploits with it. So
100%. Awesome. The new model of media buying has become our onboarding for all of our staff at our agency. So if you guys don't know, I also own Heman Media, which is our main company. That's our mothership of a company. That is Heman Media. And right now we have about 35 full-time staff. We manage about $5 million a month in ad spend. And this, what I'm about to show you, is a part of the onboarding for them. Before they can ever touch an ad account, they got to go through this training. They got to understand it so they can use this process, because I know if they use this process, they're going to be more effective, which equals better results for clients, which equals lower churn, which equals happier Ashton. Okay. So it's very important, right? My media buyers legit aren't even allowed to touch the accounts, like I said, without proving that they know this new model. The proving is through exams, through tests, through sandbox campaigns. And so this is very important that my team knows this. And this new model equals decentralized account structures.
Let me jump in right here for just 1 minute, if you don't mind, because we forgot the old recap slide. So we're going to cover, essentially the 4 phases of our deployment that we use inside of our agency. We won't spend too much time on phase 0. Just understand that it's there. But phase 1, we're going to talk about targeting testing. We're going to talk about phase 2, which is creative testing. We're going to talk about phase 3, which is scaling.
With that said, let's go ahead and jump in. New model equals decentralized account structures. Now, this is very important because I want you to think about, the first thing that every media buyer must do to produce consistent results is ultimately, like we said earlier, gain the control in the ad account, right? If you're someone who wants to conduct an experiment, well, what good is an experiment as the conductor of the experiment if you have no control over the experiment itself? You've got to make sure that you can implement controls. Therefore, you can test your hypothesis, and therefore you can iterate and adapt into your next segment, right? So why did we even call this decentralized account structures? Well, the reason is because when you think about what, decentralization or centralization is, let's say, maybe some of you might be some crypto fans, then you'll get this a lot easier. But the concept is, when you think about a decentralized structure, the purpose of a decentralized structure or network in and of itself is to ensure that there's no single point of failure. Right? You don't want a single point of failure inside of your system, because what happens if that single point becomes flawed? What happens when you put all your faith into an algorithm that is constantly changing, constantly adapting, constantly evolving their privacy policies or removing audiences or adding audiences? What happens when you put all of the weight of success on that single point? Well, it absolutely hurts your results, right? And so the purpose of what we call decentralizing your ad account is to create multiple points of control, right? When a point fails, it doesn't destroy campaigns B, C, D, and E, right? When you find flawed data in campaign C, it doesn't ruin all the tests that you were carrying on in campaigns A and B. Right? So the point is to create multiple points of tests and to make sure that you're implementing control, right? In some of the old ways, you would have heard this as, the simple tofu, mofu, and bofu structures. Or you would have heard this as Facebook would call, simplified account structures, right? Where ideally that what they wanted was one campaign, 1 or 2 ad sets, CBO, DCO, or dynamic creative testing, right? And they wanted all of the control in one area. Now, while this is an area where there could be large debate, you could have different feelings or opinions. And while I would even say that this isn't the only way to run an ad account, I will say that we probably run more ad spend than most people. We handle the accounts for higher name brands than most people. And we've tested just about every strategy in the book that you can think of. And what I look for over anything is not just one strategy that caused a moonshot campaign. We keep referring back to crypto type terminology, but I'm not just looking for a strategy that worked really well for one account. I'm looking for the strategy that allows us to consistently get good results across all accounts, right? Yeah. How many of you want a structure that allows you more times than not to have a stable and consistent data flow, right? You're not just looking for the quick hack to make $1 million overnight on one account, and then all of a sudden the next day you lose $1 million, right? You're looking for something reliable, consistent, something that you can count on that feeds you the data and doesn't just optimize and then you still don't learn anything from it, right? That's what we want to give you today. Jonathan, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that, the underarching sort of foundation of this is that we're organizing things for empirical accuracy. We want to know as much as we can possibly know at the end of our endeavors about the ideal consumer going forward. It's usable, it's redeemable at all levels, right? So if I wanted to just pop a question real quick to the audience, what do you think is the purpose of split testing? What do you think? Just type it in the chat real quick. I'd love to see what you guys' ideas are about the purpose of split testing in advertising. What is the point? Wait for any answers, anybody. Test more variations quicker, see what people respond to more, get a control, find more effective hooks, audiences. All right, so I would submit to you that all of those answers are interesting, but ultimately wrong. And I'll tell you why. The tree is knowledge. The fruit is increased conversion, right? The fruit is empirical lift in conversion rate. What we want is the knowledge that we derive from testing that we can then iterate and use to increase our conversion rates, right? So that empirical environment is super important to get to that end. Otherwise, if it's a non-empirical environment, we haven't learned what we think we've learned. We have an invalidated, usually sample predominantly. We have not controlled our variables when we lump everything into tofu. So anything that we learn is suspect, right? And we don't want it to be suspect. We want it to be as concrete as possible so that we can get to those lifts in conversion rate. The purpose of testing is to learn, and we can't learn if we don't have an empirical environment. So that, as much as anything else, is why we do it this way.
100%, 100%. So to cover some of the concepts that we have here, why is it that CBO versus ABO, right? When you're only using that kind of decision-making to build campaigns, it creates convoluted and distorted data signals back to you. It presents to you information that might not actually be accurate. And so while CBO and ABO are modalities or ways of creating a campaign, they're not absolutes. Example, you're not looking to create a CBO for CBO's sake, right? There's always got to be a means to an end. And when it comes down to CBO versus ABO, that is a means to the end, which is ultimately what Jonathan was saying, is it's knowledge. It's a means to give data back to you. So what we want to teach you today is, as you're creating campaigns, every single campaign that you're creating, the purpose of it, rather like that, even though your end goal is to get better results, realistically what it is should be delivering cleaner data back to you so that you can make decisions to keep moving your campaign or marketing forward. Right? Power 5, volatile and bad signals. Now, Power 5 is great in concept, right? Just like a lot of things, they can be great in theory, but when put into practice, it's not exactly as effective as everyone claims it to be, right? How many of you might have Facebook reps? We have tons of Facebook reps. They might say, hey, this ultimately does better, but ultimately when it comes down to practice, it doesn't always work out the way. Now, some of you who are OGs, been media buying since 2016, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't always work out the way they say it should. And guess who then is left holding the bag and trying to explain to your client why you just burned through a lot of money, right? So we want to help do that less. So here's the new way, right? Same concept, decentralized account structures. This is what we want. We want a network of data that not only communicates to each other, but communicates back to you and allows you to be the puppet master at the top, to pull the strings, to move a campaign over here, move it over here, because ultimately you are in the driver's seat and you see the end goal, right? So instead of a tofu, mofu, bofu, or a power five, you're going to learn concepts like sandboxing, pre-gaming, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? And the purpose of these is to give clear and concise campaign objectives, right? Better data flow, and ultimately helps to install decision makers inside of your campaigns and your ad account. This is a big aspect to it. Decision makers. You want something to help you make decisions better, right? Because when you're looking at an ad account all day, or if you have hundreds of campaigns, or even if you're not that large, no matter what, over a certain period of time, it can become easy for your campaigns to become confusing. And when you lose clarity on your account, you lose clarity on the end result. You lose clarity on how to move the account to get better results for yourself, right? And ultimately, what we want to do is develop high-performance marketing machines, not just media buying machines, right? You want to be a marketer first, a media buyer second. Jonathan, what are we looking at?
Well, we're looking at the overarching campaign structure of the way we do it, and we're going to break this down for you guys. So don't worry too much about squinting at this slide. Every campaign feeds data into the next campaign. Each phase contains those decision enhancers that Ashton's talking about. It's going to make making decisions on the daily basis way, way easier inside of your account. It's going to take away all the fear and anxiety that you have about making big moves, which I've seen a lot of upstart media buyers. That's the thing that we see in most accounts that people are having trouble with. But more importantly, it's like, the old way of doing things is like building a house on sand to me. It shifts around underneath you. This is going to be building house on bedrock. It naturally builds a deep, wide foundation that will stabilize your accounts, even in crazy algorithms and crazy economic times. How many of you know the economy is not really cooperating with us right now? It doesn't really matter in our accounts. Like, we're still winning, and that's because of this bedrock foundation. So that's what we want to give to you guys. We'll get into the structure. So again, you don't need to squint at that slide too much, but that's what we're going to do here.
Phase 1. Jonathan, tell us about phase 1.
Well, phase 1 is all about audience farming. That's what we're going to do when we're trying to figure out to whom we should be marketing. How many of you understand that in order to have effective marketing, we need to both say the right thing, and we have to say it to the right people, right? So there's two real components there. Phase 1 is all about the right people part of that little equation. And a lot of you guys probably are running into what we call learning phase purgatory. It's because your accounts are set up in such a way that you can't really effectively exit the learning phase and allow the algorithm to do what it needs to do. So we're going to show you how to circumvent that. And not for nothing, you can do a lot of low risk testing with this setup. So that's what we're going to do here in phase 1.
Awesome. So go ahead and keep going with this, and then I'll cover the next and do the example.
So a lot of questions that we see when we start talking about phase 1 audience farming is, where are you getting these ideas? This is where the previous episodes of the Master Series are going to become really, really important for you guys, because the testing ideas for phase 1 will come almost extensively from the pre-work research activities that we discussed in the previous weeks. So who is the prospect? What do they use? What kind of groups do they belong? What sort of affiliations do they have? What circles are they running in? What pages are they following? Those kinds of things are going to form the basis for what we target in phase 1. Alongside of that, I've included a little screenshot here from a document that our guy Joshua put together, which is like a really good sort of high level look at what we do with lookalike audiences when we're doing phase 1 testing. So customer and client lists, we'll do website visitors and landing page visitors. We'll do fan page followers and engagers. We'll do ad engagers. We'll do all kinds of lookalike audiences, and we'll run them all in phase 1. And we'll pare down to the ones that are really, really effective at producing the results that we want to see. So that's just a reference for you. There's a bunch listed there. We'll get into it. But in addition, there are several automatic audiences that should probably always get tested. And those come predominantly from this list here that you see, but also just from experience. Like, for instance, a couple of the audiences that I always test that maybe are not so intuitive for everyone else. I will always test literature and periodicals around any given vertical that I'm marketing for. So for the Human X business, if we're trying to engage with agency owners and or entrepreneurs who want to train their media buyers, well, then I'm going to target the things that they might read, right? For expert coaching businesses, it's going to be, Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. It's going to be the 4-Hour Work Week. It's going to be making friends and influencing people, all the things that you would think people in that vertical would watch. And for periodicals, it's going to be Ad Week. It's going to be the Harvard Business Review. It's going to be really intuitive things that we know from experience that those people are going to gravitate towards. And then on top of that, we're going to do all of these lookalike audiences. And those are sort of the things that we automatically test. So if that makes sense, Ashton, you ready?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's
awesome.
go.
Before we kind of jump in and me like showing you how to actually create the phase one, I want you guys to understand the concept of it. Okay. So I want you guys to think about, an audience like this circle right here. When it comes to your audience on Facebook, I want you to think of, let's say, for example, this audience right here is Tony Robbins, right? And let's say that this audience represents about, 15 million people. Okay. So 15 million, when people go and create an ad set or it has an interest inside of an ad set and they go after an audience that's fairly large, and let's say your daily budget is $50 a day, right? An average budget, clearly your $50 is not going to allow you to test the entire audience that you see inside of this circle, right? It would be impossible. You will not reach the 15 million people there. And so what we wanted to do when we go to audience test, or what we call audience farm inside of phase one, what we're looking to do is essentially go, how can we more accurately test an audience without spending A, too much money, and B, not relying all of our results again on a single point of failure. Right. But what I mean is how most people build their ad accounts is they have this big audience and then they go, ooh, let me spend $50 a day, right? Testing this audience. Wow, that was an interesting five. But they spend $50 a day testing this audience and then it doesn't work. And then they go, oh, well, okay, Tony Robbins just must not work. Well, that's not at all accurate, right? Because we already know, well, there's no way you tested all of it. Realistically, your $50 might have tested right up here. And then that was it. And then you canceled out the rest of the audience because the small pocket did not work, right? And so we don't want to do that. Inside of phase one, what we do is we create what we call micro budget tests into various different pockets of a bigger audience, right? And so let me show you an example of what that looks like, right? Let's say I wanted to test the audience Gary Vaynerchuk, right? Fairly typical audience for an entrepreneur or business lead gen type of advertisement. And so when we go to create Gary Vaynerchuk, we create a campaign where it has single based interests in each one. And then each one of interests or the ad sets inside of it are the same core audience, meaning each ad set is Gary Vaynerchuk, but then we test micro segments of it, forcing the ad set to go to a different pocket, right? So ad set one might be male plus female, 1 day click. Ad set two might be feeds only, male plus female, 1 day click. Ad set three might be auto placement, male only. 4, female only. 5, male plus female, but 7-day view. And the purpose and the intention of doing this is essentially like us going, okay, what we want to do is what we want to do is we want to create this audience, right? And we want to go, okay, ad set A most likely is going to test this segment. And then we want to force the ad set B somewhere else. And then we want to test somewhere else and test somewhere else. Why do you think that we would do something like this? The purpose is to test the different pools. Because how much more confident can you be when you go to spend more money on it when, let's say, out of the 5 tests, or out of the 5 tests, this was another segment that you have, out of the 5 tests, let's say all of them but 1 failed. Well, that gives you a higher level of confidence to spend more money on that audience because out of the 5 tests, it succeeded 4 out of 5 times, right? On the flip side, some of you might go, hey, all of a sudden, when I launched it first on a small budget, it did well, but then when I spent higher amounts of money, it failed. Well, perhaps if you had actually done a phase 1, you tested different pockets of the audience, perhaps what you would have found that maybe actually only 1 out of the 5 actually did well, but the other ones all failed. When you see something like that, your confidence in that audience should go low, and you should have only 2 outcomes. Either 1, you want to reattempt because perhaps maybe the angle of positioning you're coming at the audience was incorrect, or B, that audience is not actually the audience you want to go for. Because make no mistake, the algorithm is good at finding customers. It's very good at finding customers. And so a lot of times what happens is when you first launch, the algorithm goes straight to the people that it believes are hot and ready to buy. But the more time and the more money you spend behind the audience, the more Facebook goes, it's getting harder and harder to find customers within the audience that you've given us. Yep. Does that make sense? Are you guys catching that?
I'm going to make a futurist prediction on that topic right now. In 3 years, there will be no interest that you can target whatsoever on Facebook. It just will not exist any further because the algorithms are getting so good that I think in 3 years, with all the GDPR privacy concerns, iOS 14, inter-brand rivalries causing the data fidelity to plummet, what you're going to have is a really, really good algorithm on Facebook where when you set up an account, you seed it with a list and it does everything else from that point forward. And that's all that you're going to have available to you for targeting, which is doubly why it's important to become a super good marketer. Okay. But that's where it's going. And that's why this structure is sort of, we're stepping ahead of the curve in that direction, and taking some of the consternation out of the targeting conversation.
I want you to write these down because ultimately there are 3 variables inside of your ad account that you're always testing for. Okay. And you're going to test each of these variables in different structures and in different ways, but ultimately you're trying to find the answer to all 3 because that's when businesses truly scale. That's when your ad account can truly scale. The first one is creative. Okay. Creative. I want you to write that down. The first one is creative. You have to have the right message, right? The second variable that you have is audience. Okay. Audience. The last one that you are going to be testing is account structure, campaign structure, rather. Campaign structure, okay? Because inside of your ad account, the goal or the game that you're ultimately playing is, how do I find the right message, the right audience, and the right campaign structure to give me maximum efficiency when I scale, right? And you cannot scale efficiently unless you have the answer to all 3 questions. Right. And so when it comes to these structures, phase 1 is its aim is to answer the question of right audience. How do I find the right audience? But in order to do so, in order to test the right audience correctly, what must you also have? Well, the right message, right? Because if you're testing in phase 1 and you're going to these audiences and you're testing, well, if it works, it has to work because you're assuming the right message is being delivered. Right. So anytime we train a media buyer on doing a phase 1, before they can do a phase 1, they must first have the right message and what we would call a control ad to actually efficiently do a phase 1. Because if you do a phase 1 and you're testing all these audiences, but the ad has never been proven to work, it's never been delivering consistent, good results, predictably, well, then you never actually know if that audience didn't work or if it was just the wrong ad, right? So great question. You need to make sure it's a control-based ad. So if you have no data, then you would do what's called a phase 0, which is kind of a combination of what we're going to show you, phase 1 and phase 2. It's just a different setup. But phase 1, if you're doing a phase 1, you need to have an ad that works that it has history of working. So that way, when you're testing these audiences, you don't have that thing in the back of your head of going, well, I just wonder if it was a bad ad, right? You don't want that question. So hopefully that answers. Great that you brought that up, Jonathan. Mm-hmm. Cool. So let me show you when it's played out, how big a phase one can actually look, right? Now, again, remember, these are micro budgets. The goal is to have your budgets here around anywhere from $5 to $20 a day. Now, if you do $20 a day, you just need to make sure you still do these correctly. A lot of times I see people do a phase one, quote unquote phase one, and they have higher budgets, but then they didn't follow the whole process because they just don't want to do all that work. Essentially, they'll go, oh, I'll just have one ad set at $20 a day, then 4 ad sets at $5 a day. And again, it ruins the whole point. Okay. So just please follow along a little bit later. Or follow along on the strategy. So this is kind of what it looks like from a macro view, right? Now, when it comes to, hey, what audiences should I be testing in a phase one? I really have a couple categories that I do. First is competitor interest. That's typically the first type of interest that I'm really going to be sniffing for, right? I found that competitor interests are typically your highest quality of interest to go after, outside of maybe a lookalike audience or your warm audiences. Competitor interests are very good, right? Because people have already proven that they have liked products similar to yours or services similar to yours. So I start there, right? But then it goes into influencer-based interests typically. What are the biggest influencers of that industry or of that market? Then I move into publications, like let's think magazines, book titles, like Jonathan was saying earlier. Book authors is just up there with, influencers. That's where I would consider them. And then you go into more broader, right? Hobby or broad interests, right? Think if you're going after business owners, your interest might be small business owner behaviors, right? That's something that you can target, right? So that would be more the broad that you can test. And then ultimately you can start testing lookalikes, which is what Jonathan has already kind of shown you. That's what you can go after, right? But as you can see here, the purpose is to have anywhere from 5. I said 20, if you have the budget, you can do 20, 15 is about the average. But here's the thing. You want to have these things go for about 3 to 5 days, right? And ultimately, when I'm making decision, you can see how many ad sets are ultimately inside of this campaign. But what I'm looking for here is I let them run to about $20. And then when I don't like the results, if they've spent at least $20, gone at least 3 days, then I'll start cutting, right? And the thing is, and what I'm looking for is averages, right? On average, if I've launched these ad sets, how many of them on average are winning, right? I'm looking for the ad sets that, hey, out of the 4 tests I did, or out of the 5 tests I did, are they achieving 80% success? Right. And then the ones that aren't doing, the ones that are, hitting 1 or 0 out of 5 are doing well, cut them and then bring in the next interest to start testing. And the goal is to start creating an ever evolving, ever adapting audience farming campaign, so that then the purpose thinking macro is as you eventually get to the campaigns in phase 3 that you're scaling, as those start to fatigue, or as you go, hey, we need to probably refresh the audiences, boom, my phase 1 is already doing that. And so boom, now I can just move them into my phase 3. Does that make sense? So if your CPA is low enough, your goal is to ultimately just find the end result. Can you get those end results better? Here's where it's an interesting game, and it requires you to start using some more gut, because at the end of the day, the auctions will give you an advantage by having low budgets. The Facebook has admitted this on campfire chats with their development teams. If you guys don't know what those are, you can go to like business.facebook.com. They do these campfire chats all the time where they'll bring out their data scientists, their algorithm, developers, and they'll talk about the ad structures, right? And as they evolve, they start to talk about, one of the times they talked about, how do the small businesses actually compete? Let's think about it. If the algorithm was always just based on bid or budget or data signal, well, then companies like Coca-Cola or companies like, CNN, any of the big companies would blow all the little guys out of the water, right? You'd never be able to get good results. And so their algorithms will actually give you an advantage in the auction place when you have low budgets, right? So what happens is, in the power of micro budgets, while they're not scalable, hence, again, please don't just do a phase 1 and never do anything. They're not designed to be profitable. They're designed to give you data, right? And so we create these micro budgets because when we give Facebook $5, we're telling them, Facebook, you have $5 to find me a conversion. And so what Facebook will do is go give you typically the best chances at finding conversions. So what you're kind of looking for is really low conversion costs. What's the end result? Whether it's purchase, lead, application, whatever it is, you want to find the cheapest thing there. Now, when you can't find that, what you look for is what we call leading indicators, right? And so what you look for is, okay, when you have a winning campaign, if you've had proven data before, then what is the numbers that were inside of that campaign? Example, what were the click costs on average? What were the click-through rates on average? What were CPM costs on average? What was unique outbound clicks cost on average, right? What were those things, or even cost per landing page view, all that kind of stuff? What were all the other metrics outside of the end result that I can use to then go and predict other campaigns that have potentials of being a winner, right? So AKA, let's say in my phase one, I realized that, hey, all my winning campaigns I have in my other campaigns, scaling, past, current, whatever, all of those campaigns typically had a $2.30 click cost, right? Well, then if you launch a phase one and you start noticing, hey, out of the 4 out of the 5 tests, all of my click costs were around $1, then there's a good high likely chance that that ad set is going to be a future winner, so long as your click-through rates and everything else also aligns with your winning outcomes, right? Now, it is not a law. There's always the chance that, hey, it could be bringing cheaper traffic, but that doesn't mean it's bringing higher quality customers. But all we're looking for, again, is more data for you to make better decisions. Does that make sense, Jonathan? Anything to add to that?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat. What attribution tools do you use to get to the bottom of this? And I think we should just talk about that for 1 minute because Facebook is irregular at best. Yeah, post iOS 14, basically all the tools that we know of are pretty irregular along the same lines. Some work slightly better than others. A lot of people swear by the Hyruses of the world. But what I'm going to tell you is when it comes to actual numbers of conversions, you want to benchmark on physical redundancies. So what I mean by that is anything that's pixel based is going to, in terms of attribution, is going to be skewed in exactly the same way as Facebook. Delayed data, aggregated data, anonymized data. It creates all the same problems for all the software suites. So what we suggest that you do is that you build separate funnels for every single source of traffic, right? So if, for instance, if you we're going to test Facebook against Google, you'd want separate funnels so that you can then go to the CRM, look at the physical number of conversions and attribute it appropriately, right? Now, that does get tedious if you're trying to get granular data on one platform with a bunch of different targeting audiences, but it can be done. So for instance, if you wanted to run a different funnel for every audience, you could also do that. So yeah, like physical redundancy is absolutely the best thing. However, when it comes to leading indicators, the factors that are self-contained within the Facebook ecosystem will be mostly correct. So when you're talking about, ad impressions, video view metrics, click-through rates, all of those numbers are going to be mostly accurate. So we like to look at click-through rate all. We like to look at unique outbound click-through rate. Those numbers should be accurate. Where you will find problems is when you then go try to check it against the same data like in Hyros or some attribution suite. You'll see that it represents less than Facebook does, and that's because of the iOS 14 knockout of data, essentially.
100%. Awesome. Let's go ahead and resume back again here. Phase number 2. Jonathan, kick us off.
All right, so phase number 2, we're going to test creative. Again, you got to have the right people that you're talking to. That's what phase 1's all about. Then you got to say the right thing to them. That's one of the reasons that we like to use leading indicators to determine whether or not a phase 1 campaign is successful. So for instance, let's say that you have a unique outbound click-through rate from Facebook that's north of 3%, but you don't necessarily have the conversion data to say that that is a success. Well, in my brain, for my scientific merit, I want to know, all right, they're obviously interested in the sentiment. If I organize that ad in a different way or use a different video or come at it with a different image or a different trope, can I then take what appears to be a viable targeting option and turn it into conversions with creative. So that's what phase 2 is all about. Our phase 2, it's also designed like a scientific experiment. We control absolutely as many variables as we can control in the process, understanding that some of this is done algorithmically, and there's always going to be something of a sampling bias for all of you like real data nerds. I know, I get it, okay, I'm with you. But we control as many variables as we can control. And ultimately, it's about squeezing the most juice, and by juice, we usually mean profit, out of each campaign. So let's hit the next slide. Again, you don't need to scrutinize that little slide too much. Where do the creative ideas come from? Same thing. We had a question a little earlier about where do the targeting ideas come from. If you guys missed the first 3 sessions of the Master Series, it comes from what we taught you in those sessions, essentially. All that pre-work, all of that research and empathy mapping. So that's what you see here is a picture of our empathy map. That's exactly where we're going to take our creative testing ideas from. So if you go through the process that we covered in week 2, you're going to go through that empathy map. You're going to generate ideas based on what is your ideal prospect seeing? What are they saying? What are they hearing? What are they feeling? And then you're going to rate those ideas according to appeal, according to exclusivity, all the factors that are in the sheet that we gave you. And it will tell you, once you've rated them, which ones are the strongest hooks to start with. And that's exactly what you're going to use to go ahead and create iterations for phase 2. This is virtually an endless supply of new ads and variations. I'd like to have Lee at some point in time maybe talk about this, because there actually are indirect and direct approaches to every one of those hooks. You can use our 2x2 method. There's a lot of ways to extrapolate those insights into an infinite number of ad variations that we can test. So that's where the information comes from.
So when we talk about this, right, we've realized, we established, by the time you've completed phase 1, let's pretend you've completed that. And now it's like, okay, now I'm moving to phase 2. Well, now it comes down, if we think about the scientific equation, we've now solved the what audience, and now it's time to go, how do we get a better message in front of that audience, right? We're assuming at this point you've had some kind of baseline layer of a control, of an ad, of messaging that ultimately helps convert the marketplace. So now in phase 2, it's always going, how do I beat the control? Right? And that's always the goal. That's how this account should always be running. Phase 1 should always be trying to find new ways to beat your control audience. Phase 2 should always be trying to beat your control creative, your control angle, positioning, hook, headline, video, image. It doesn't matter. The goal is to consistently move the needle forward to go, how can I communicate to my market better? And how can I communicate to them more effectively? AKA better conversions, better moolah. Let's dive into a little bit of an example of what we should be looking for when it comes to this phase 2. And let me open up here real quick. All right, so phase 2, the purpose, like we said, is to test new creatives, new interests. And so the purpose or the concept that you should be getting to at this point is like, okay, phase 1 is successful. Now I'm starting to bring those phases into my phase 2, or those audiences into my phase 2. And now we're going to start testing interest, right? And so there's a couple different structures that we use for testing phase 2. And the first one is using the concepts of, okay, if I found stacked interests that work together, I'm going to start lumping those together because I want to test faster. And the point is to get directional data, right? In phase 2, you don't necessarily right off the bat need to keep your things micro because you've already tested them in phase 1, right? And so Facebook, by and large, does do better normally when you give them larger audiences, right? Now, the problem that a lot of people run into, though, is they go, hey, I've been running broad, which is what Facebook says, and my results still suck. Well, sometimes that's actually because your broad audience has still been untested. Right? You could still have interests in that broad audience that are not effective, that are not good for you to be advertising towards. But just because you started adding them in together, and sometimes you could fall into the suggestions problem, right? Where it's just, hey, Facebook suggested this, so add, because it's easier, and Facebook just opens the list. Well, the goal here is to only be using audiences that you know are already proven, right? And when you know your audience has already been proven, you can react and act much more fluidly because you're not as concerned about, hey, is every audience inside of that ad set good or not? Well, you've already proven that. So what we like to do is typically start off with a base campaign that's really stacked, right? And when we say stacked, we just mean those interests that you found in phase one, you just put them together in phase two, because now you're giving Facebook a larger audience and you are giving them more room to optimize, right? So in this, typically we'll start out with 3 ad sets. First ad set is stacked interests. These are interests that were proven in phase one. And then we typically will do auto, and we won't typically change the demographic unless it's very demographic specific as far as a market, right? If your audience is clearly 35-plus-year-old women, then go ahead and make it 35-plus-year-old woman, right? But if it is on average, gender neutral and age neutral, go ahead and leave it open. Ad set number 2 is a stacked lookalike audiences number 1. Here's a key note here. You can test your lookalike audiences number 1 in phase 1. You can do that. By and large, I don't typically test my lookalike 1% of my main conversions, meaning I don't typically phase 1 test my 1% lookalike of purchasers, or my 1% lookalike of ad payment infos, or my 1% highest LTV customers, things like that, because by definition, these should be good audiences. So I don't typically test those a ton. And then ad set number 3 is your stacked behaviors. Those are those audiences you tested in phase 1, like small business owners, or maybe it's moms, or maybe people expecting, or people coming on an anniversary, whatever those behaviors are that are proven. That's an ad set number 3. Now, an ad set and beyond the ad set, right? Because ultimately this should already be the control. You shouldn't have to do much thinking here. The majority of your time is spent here, right? This is where the money is found inside of phase 2. And this is really what we focus on. Now, when it comes to what do I use inside, what kind of ads should these be? I want you to always, always, always be thinking of what is my control. And that's what you should always be testing against. Inside of ad sets, we typically always like a minimum of 3 ads. And one of those ads should at all times be a control-based ad. What that means is an ad that has been proven, because the purpose is to test this ad against this ad, and this ad against this ad. You want to find the winners here, and you're not just looking for things to do well. You want to beat the control. And then the goal is, make sure you understand this, is why did these ads beat the control ad? That's ultimately what you're looking for. It's not just an ad to beat and win and get better results. It's why did it win? So all of these tests, the things that you're doing, should have a specific purpose behind them of why you're launching them. Not just because it's new copy or new creative, but there should be something actually different about it, that if it wins, it tells you something about the control ad. If it loses, it also tells you something about the control ad. And so when we go about testing them, normally we will test with macro ideas. When we think macro ideas, I want you to think of brand new angles, brand new big ideas, not just new headlines, new hooks. They always first start out with macro ideas. Jonathan, do you have any thoughts on this? I'm going to actually pull up a graph that'll help illustrate it.
Yeah. So most of you guys are going to scrutinize the extreme nuances of the copy as beginners to this process. Like for instance, if I change line number 3, or if I add, this or take this away, is it going to improve the performance of the ad? What you're going to find is that the vast majority of those types of tests result in what we call regression to the mean, which means that you might get a temporary lift, but that lift cannot be attributed to the ad. It's just environmental or time-based or seasonality, any of a number of things. What we find is that hooks, big ideas, cause conversion. Like if your ad is in the ballpark of where you want it to be, then those little tiny text alignments might make your ad win and might be what you're looking for. But if you're not close, like if you're getting a 1% conversion rate and you know it needs to be 10%, you're not going to do that with micro text adjustments. You need big ideas. You need different hooks. You need to go back to the empathy map and pick something else that is causing your prospect pain and align that and run that test, right? But I also wanted to point out, like, this is 6th grade science class, right? Hypothesis leads to testing ideas. I'm a big fan of keeping track of those hypotheses. So I will never just launch a test where I just wrote 5 different variations of ad copy and I don't really have a theory as to why it will work. I always start with the hypothesis. So for instance, this will work better because I've enhanced the exclusivity of the product through text, right? Or this will work better, but version A will outperform version B because the hook is more pain oriented to the prospect on average, all else equal. That's a hypothesis, right? So I always start with a hypothesis, which I then either prove or disprove through empirical testing, right? Just like 6th grade science. That's all it is, guys. All right. Back to you, Ash.
All right. I found it. Eureka. All right. Here's what I wanted to talk about, because this does illustrate the fragmentation that you can go through inside of the phase 2. So what I'm about to show you is kind of a graph of how we can go through data, or go through copy testing, go through overall ad testing in a phase 2, and how it's a sequential order, right? And we kind of break it down from most significant, macro, down to the most insignificant. And what you'll actually find, ironically, is the most insignificant is what I found most media buyers spend the most time on. And so let's go ahead, and I'm going to open up real quick. And I'm not going to go through it in depth, because again, this is more for students inside of HumanX. We train them on how to do this. And so if you see some, concepts and you're like, hey, what is 820? What is 64.4? Well, join HumanX and we'll train you on it, make you a badass at it. But when it comes to testing, right, overall, what we typically do, and this is even just one big idea, right? One big idea. I want you to keep that in mind. This is the level of depth that you can go into when you just have one idea of an ad. And in phase 2, I can tell you your biggest advantage, biggest needle mover, leverage point as a marketer is finding big ideas. New big ideas, producing new big ideas. And then as you create new big ideas, you can then start to distill those down into different fragments of an ad to get more longevity, to optimize it, to get better costs. But ultimately, it all starts with this bad boy right here at the beginning, right? So in phase 2, you're going to kind of come into it and assuming that you already have control, right? So that control is actually representative of a big idea. Whether you know it or not, that ad conveys a big idea to your market. And so what you can start to do is to break that big idea down into 2 ways: direct, indirect, or direct. If you don't know the difference between indirect or direct ads, a direct ad would be something like, right now, get 50% off our 6-week fitness boot camp, right? That would be very direct. Indirect would be something like along the lines of, now you can feel better, look better, act better for cheaper than ever before. Very indirect. You don't exactly know what that means, but typically, and for you guys, if you're not quite aware, direct is much better for an audience or a marketplace that is very aware of their problems, the solutions, and the products. Right? If you're someone who knows computers, knows the different brands, it doesn't serve me to go a computer, a device that is better to help you get anything you've ever wanted ever before, right? I don't have to do that. I can just tell you the iMac is now this price, right? Because you're aware of the products, aware of the problem, aware of the solution. Right? But on the flip side, if someone isn't quite aware or doesn't necessarily know the different fitness deals out there, doesn't essentially know the path towards getting what they want, you've got to be much more indirect, right? So anytime you get a big idea, the first thing we like to do is to go, okay, let's create an ad that's indirect and direct and test which one the market responds to most. Then what we like to do is we essentially what we call 80-20. Right? We'd like to start changing the things inside of the ad, the 20% of the ad that we believe creates 80% of the results, which is ultimately trying to create indirect copy idea creative number 1, testing the different video, testing video 4, and then on the indirect, doing the exact same thing. Then it transfers into basically Does this video do better? Great. How can we create 4 more assets to test against the first one? That goes well. Great. Let's move to the headline and trying to test those indirect and then direct. And you can keep going down the line, and we keep finding other leverage points inside of the ad. For example, breaking the ad down from top to bottom, it typically goes lead, or typically goes hook, the lead, to sale, to close. Transition is how we test, right? Those are the areas that affect your ad the most. And so that's how we ultimately test them. But we break these ads down into fragments and start testing those. This is essentially what your phase 2 should be doing.
Yeah, you guys are going to need to use some tools like what Ashton has here to keep this straight when you're doing it, or else it's going to be overwhelming.
Cool.
There is actually a really large volume of things you can test. And so we use these kinds of constructs you see on your screen here to keep it all organized and together, so we know what we know.
So let's go ahead and jump into phase 3. How many of you guys are ready for phase 3?
Ultimately, guys, phase 3 is what you paid the money for, right? This is what you want. You want scale at profitability, right? Now, I want to start by saying that there really shouldn't be a time that you're not running phase 1 and phase 2. So I like to clarify that on the front end, because some people think you find the right targeting in phase 1 and then you turn it off. And you find the right target or the right creative in phase 2, and then you turn it off. We never really turn those things off in our business. When I find the right targeting, I leave it running and I iterate and I drop more targeting in there and continue to test. Because ultimately, part of scaling is going to be, there's the vertical and then there's the horizontal, right? The vertical being I add more ad spend to things that are working. The horizontal being I scale by enhancing the number of interests, number of targeting options that are available to me. We want to have all of the tools in our tool belt, so we never really stop doing iterations of phase 1 and phase 2. Let's hit the next slide real quick. Phase 3, we talked about phase 1 being, getting in front of the right people. Phase 2 being saying the right thing. Phase 3 is combining those two things together and trying to go to the moon with it, basically, right? Our phase 3 is built to find the highest points of spend efficiency and bid hedging, like really fancy media buying stuff going on here. Really requires you to really have the fundamentals nailed down from phase 2 and phase 1. It allows you to get way aggressive with your testing. It allows you to be way more confident. And it's designed to really exponentially grow results. We're not talking about another 10% of scale here. We're talking about taking people from 10 grand a month to spend to 100 grand a month in spend, right? That's what ultimately our goal is, profitably. And in fact, I can't even tell you how many businesses we've broken by successfully doing phase 1 and phase 2 and getting into scale and just exploding their deliverable. You know what I mean? Or their deliverability on the back end, or outpacing their sales team. Like, you actually have to be a little bit careful with phase 3 if you've done phase 1 and phase 2 correctly, because we've broken businesses doing this. So you're on mute, brother.
100%. And just to kind of show you guys again, the purpose and what I want you guys to get more than anything out of this is, because a big mistake that many people will make is that they look at something like what we're showing you guys and they instantly jump to phase 3 and they ignore everything else and go, hey, I just want to go to phase 3. I just want to scale. Well, remember that the only way your phase 3 actually works is when you have phases 1 and 2 done correctly. And ultimately what you're trying to do is build a machine that all of it is operating together, right? So taking a step back, it's like when your phase 1 is constantly finding new audiences, that feeds it into phase 2 so that you continue finding new control creatives that allow you to spend more money on them. Because ultimately, what do you guys know about scaling? Well, your biggest problems at scaling is fatigue. Right? Is fatigue in the audience, fatigue in the creative. I can guarantee you fatigue in the creative happens much more often and much faster than fatigue in the audiences. But when you get that perfect synergy of where your phase 1 is feeding your phase 2 and your phase 2s are feeding your phase 3s with new creatives, and then as that is rolling, you can constantly add new audiences that you can trust because you've tested them in 2 other phases. Man, you get confidence, you get control, and that's ultimately what you're looking for, right? So I say all of that because this is the sexy part. This is the part that everyone loves. But honestly, phase 3 is the easiest part. Phase 3 is the easiest part because your only goal that we've now solved, you found control audiences. Now you found control creatives. Now you're just looking for control campaign structures. That's it. It's easy. And there's only so many buttons you can push in media buying. This is why so many businesses are failing. They're trying to find new buttons to press in the ads manager rather than actually being good at marketing, right? The reason why they're failing is not because their media buying sucks. Most of the time, it's actually just because they suck at marketing and they always counted on their media buying to make up for it, right? But when you apply it, it works, right? Trevor, for example, here, when he started doing this, instantly his clients started sending him messages like this. Leads have gone through the roof, right? Started showing it. How much do you love, if this was your clients sending you messages like this? When you start to do this, first time getting sub $10 CPLs post iOS 14. When you start doing this, you can start getting 20x ROASs, right? Like we showed earlier. When you start doing this, I actually saw them in the lobby, right? They started applying just one of these strategies and they got us a ROAS here. What is this? A 16x ROAS just from doing this. I actually saw them inside of the waiting room. He's here. So when you start doing this, it literally turns your old crappy engine, your car that you're trying to create to produce profit, your vehicle that you use, whether you believe it or not, your ad account is a vehicle, and turns it into a delicious supercar. And funny story, both of these cars were mine. This is my car now, and that was my car before. But the point of it is, it does really, really work. And so let me open this up. Here are a few different structures that you can start using right away. They're very easy. And again, when you know that your ad or your ads are controls, your audience are controls, you can start experimenting much more. So here are 4 very basic scaling structures that you can use to start growing your account. First one I'll show you is actually option number 2, but this is actually by far the easiest that you can do. When you find a campaign that's working, you can notice that this is very much set up like a phase 2 or one of the phase 2 options. Just assume that this is a phase 2. When you see something working, let's say your phase 2 starts crushing, one of the easiest things you can do is actually duplicate it 3, 4, even 5 times. And essentially what you're looking for is an average, right? If campaign number 1 is doing well, then instantly we kind of almost create that campaign structure as a control because it was working, right? And so what you can start to realize is, okay, that starting budget was a control. The number of ad sets was a control. What was inside of the ad sets is a control. And now those ads are control. You can just duplicate them 3, 4, or 5 times. And what you're looking for is, just like in a phase 1, hey, out of the 4 times I duplicated this campaign, or the 5 times, hey, 3 of them are going to work. 2 of them are going to suck. I'm going to turn off 2 of them. And now I have 3 campaigns that are working instead of just 1. So you've effectively 3x'd your spend and your performance, right? Super, super simple. We call it just super stack or super scaling. So typically when I create them, you'll just see the SS1, SS2, SS3, SS4, SS5. That just stands for super scaling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Next option is just creating this into a DCO. And then typically what I'll do is you can just start slow scaling your campaign 20 to 25% every 3 to 4 days as you see efficiency. Now, one of the things I want to call out here, because this is actually one of those ones that everyone really knows about, but I actually see a lot of people make mistakes here. Keep in mind, and let me just do this because it's easier to see your faces, or Jonathan's face, someone. But keep in mind, as you're scaling these 20 to 25%, what you want to do is essentially make sure it has a good spend efficiency ratio. And what I mean by that is a lot of people will increase their budgets 15, 20%. That's what everyone's kind of been taught. FYI, you can actually raise your budget up to 25% without knocking your campaign in the learning phase. So just knowing learning mode or whatever, just know you can actually typically increase it higher than most people think. But realistically, what I see a lot of people do is they keep increasing their budgets, but they don't actually watch it spend the budget. And so they just keep increasing the budget so long performance is there. But what they actually might be missing is that when they increase the budget to, let's say, $100, that campaign might have only spent $70. And then the next day they actually increase it again, and it's still spending way below its budget. But then you start forcing Facebook to spend money. And let me tell you something, Facebook will spend your money. They love spending your money. And so what you want to make sure is when you increase budget, does Facebook spend quickly follow? What you absolutely love is when you have a $100 budget and Facebook spends $101 or $102. That means Facebook was finding conversions easily, auctions easily to jump into. And so long as you increasing the budget, you want to make sure that Facebook is spending at least 95% of your budget, right? If it's below 95% of your budget, I wouldn't really increase your budget, because at that point you might just be forcing Facebook to spend, even though it's not having an easy time finding conversions. And then eventually you just start overspending and it goes back to it. Does that make sense?
That would be vertical scaling.
Exactly. Vertical scale.
Vertical scale.
Absolutely. Another easy way to scale, let me open back up here, is moving into more of a CBO. And what you want to do here is use all your proven post IDs, right? You can notice over here in phase one, we turned this into a DCO, meaning we took all of our control creatives, made sure that they align together, and we can put it into a DCO. Now, what DCO allows you to do while scaling is it allows Facebook to switch out creatives, switch out headlines as it sees fit. And essentially what this does, it helps you remove a lot of the fatigue that you'll face. Also, too, you don't have a learning phase inside of DCO. So you kind of jump right into winning, right? And here's the thing. When you use DCO in phase three, it doesn't actually matter. The problem a lot of people have when they use DCO is that they use DCO with unproven creatives, right? So how do you know when Facebook's spending on the wrong thing? You have no control over that. But in phase three, you have the control because you already know every single ad creative or variation that Facebook's going to use has already been tested and proven in phase two. So you don't actually have to worry about it. Now your goal, again, like we said before, is control of data, is that now your only goal is to just minimize fatigue, right? So now you can start using DCO without worrying. You can start using CBO without worrying, because everything that they're going to send money towards has already been tested and proven in previous phases, right? Cool. Last one, that's super, super easy. And we can actually show you some more advanced stuff if we have time. I want to make sure that we get plenty of time for questions, because I know we're going to get that. But there's some other fun stuff that we can talk about. The problem with a lot of the scaling templates that people show you, and this is why some of these you might go, I've seen these before. The reason why is because a lot of the things that people show you, like on the internet, Facebook groups, whatever, is stuff that worked for one person with one offer at one given time, but is not something that is easily replicated across other industries, niches, brands, offers, things like that. The last one that we typically will always train as a basic scaling objective is a cost cap, right? Which I think Facebook's actually changed the terminology, is now more target cost, I believe, is kind of like their initial thing that they just started switching over, which is kind of funny. Even lowest cost is changing. Now it's highest volume. But anyway, with cost cap, what you're looking to do is cost caps. Essentially, you want to find the proven ad set, and every single ad set is the same ad set. Every single ad set contains the same ads. And then the only difference inside of this campaign structure is each ad set is a different point of cost cap or cost limiting strategy, right? What I typically will always do is I take my average cost and I will start it about 20% lower, and then I'll inch up about 10% between each ad set. So while this shows you 4 different ad sets, realistically, you can have up to 20 different ad sets, even 50 different ad sets inside of this campaign. And your goal is just like playing Battleship, right? If I can hit right down here, let's say, ad set number 2 is what hits in this game of Battleship at $11. Well, then what I want to start doing in my other ad sets is now I'm going to go, okay, well, my next one was $12.10. That one's not hitting, but my $11 is. So now what I want to start doing is, what about $11.10, $11.25, $11.35, $11.45. And I'm just going to keep playing the game of Battleship. And basically the goal is, can I leverage all these assets to find these pockets in that area? Now, I will say this is a much more advanced and aggressive level of scaling. It will require you to have daily interaction, probably most of the time 4 to 5 times a day of interaction. And your biggest struggle here is actually not going to be your conversion costs. It's going to be deliverability. Can Facebook actually spend your money at that cost cap? And so if it's not spending it after about 45 minutes to an hour, I'm increasing my cost cap again, another 10%, until I find that sweet spot where it starts getting deliverability. And then I've started to go, oh, I've started to hit, right? And then basically I'm just adjusting all my bids until I consistently find them. The problem with something like this, not really a problem, but the issue you're going to run into, especially if you're in lead generation, is that lead costs in the auction place change daily, right? So one day, $11 might be amazing, but then the next day it might be 20. Then the next day it might be 10. So you really need to make sure that you're setting up rules to reset these bids almost daily if you really want to play the game aggressively. Because what you can do is, when you find a cost cap and it starts getting deliverability, you can turn all of these budgets to like 5, 10,000, 1,000 a day, 500 a day. And it doesn't really matter because you're starting on the low end, right? So it's important that you don't overestimate your bids, start them low, and be okay with it taking a few days for you to actually find deliverability. And then once you find deliverability, start raising budgets aggressively. And that's when you can start moving the needles.
If you've enjoyed this training, you're asking the question, how do I get access to more trainings like this, but also even in deeper detail on Meta, Google, YouTube, TikTok, consumer psychology, copywriting, all that and more? Well, then I've got news for you. There is a program I've created called Human X, which is a 17-week program designed to train marketers, media buyers, copywriters into the world of advertising and direct response in a modern day age. I and my team manage over $10 million a month in spend across all these social platforms, and there is a library of insights, trainings, and frameworks that I train my team through every single time I hire someone. But also, for recently, we've opened these trainings, these exact trainings up that I used to train my internal teams to the public, to people like you who are tired of the gimmicky, step-by-step copy-paste structures, because you understand that those things don't work, or they don't work every time. And so you would like to access a library that is built for all situations, almost every industry, almost every niche. If you're spending at least $10,000 a month on ads, these trainings are for you. And if you'd like to know how you can get your hands on not just more trainings like this, but trainings in all varieties across direct response advertising, and you want in-depth, then I can train you personally. And so around this video, you can click the link to learn more about this program, Human X, how over 300 students have already gone through it, implementing these very same practices daily for incredible results. If that's you, find the link around this video and learn more about this incredible program and see if it's a right fit for you.